It was an ordinary Saturday morning at the local soccer field. The sun had just begun to climb above the treetops, casting a golden hue over the grass. Parents were settling into their foldable chairs, kids were tying shoelaces, and coaches barked friendly instructions to their eager teams. Laughter and small talk floated in the air. Among them stood a black father, tall, composed, wearing a casual tracksuit. He had taken the day off just to watch his 8-year-old son's soccer game. A quiet pride showed on his face as he filmed warm-ups on his phone, occasionally waving to his son. To him, this was more than a game. It was a rare moment of peace and joy after long weeks of disciplined duty. As he cheered with the other parents, something changed. A murmur began among a few nearby. A man with a clipboard, clearly not part of the team, approached. He wore the kind of authority that wasn't official but believed it was. He paused in front of the father, eyes scanning him from head to toe, not with curiosity, but judgment. Without offering his name or role, he spoke bluntly. "Sir, are you here with someone?" The father answered politely, "Yes, my son's playing. Number 7. But the man wasn't satisfied. He pressed again, questioning his presence, asking for credentials no one else had been asked to show. He gestured toward the parking lot. "This field is for team families only. I think you should leave." Other parents looked away, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. The father stood firm, respectful but unwavering. "I'm his father," he repeated. "I'm not leaving." His voice was calm, deliberate. The man, flustered by the lack of submission, muttered something under his breath and walked away. The moment seemed to pass, but not really. A tension now hung in the air, one that often follows when someone refuses to be reduced to a stereotype. The father returned to his spot, folded his arms, and continued to watch, though something in him now burned. Not just because of the insult, but because this wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for a stranger in his own space. What no one on that field knew was who that man really was. Beneath the athletic jacket and sneakers stood a commanding officer in the United States Navy, a man who had led rescue missions, negotiated under pressure, and managed fleets with hundreds of personnel. A man whose leadership had earned him medals, whose service had earned him respect in places far more intense than a children's game. But here, in the middle of suburbia, his skin color was louder than his credentials. And that's exactly why he didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't announce who he was. Because the moment people only respect you when they know your title, it says more about them than you. Meanwhile, his wife, seated a few feet away, had quietly texted someone. Not to escalate, but to document. To ensure that this wouldn't become just another silent story. That call set off a chain reaction that no one could have imagined. A few hours later, back at base, word had reached the Navy's regional command. His commanding officer, outraged by the treatment of one of their own, made a call that echoed all the way through the chain of command. This wasn't just about a weekend insult. It was about representing the values the military claimed to defend on and off duty. The next day, the skies over that very same field were filled with the rhythmic sound of a helicopter's blades. Parents craned their necks. Children ran toward the fence lines. And from the belly of that aircraft stepped out the same man they'd told to leave. Not in a tracksuit, but in full Navy dress uniform. Crisp, polished, every detail in place. He didn't say a word as he walked past the crowd. This time, no one questioned his right to be there. Cameras rolled. Eyes followed. Respect now flowed freely. Not because he had changed, but because now they knew who he was. But the truth is, he had always been that man. The only difference was the uniform they had failed to see the first time. The soccer field that day wasn't just a backdrop for a children's game. It became a silent witness to a deeper, unspoken tension that often goes unnoticed in everyday spaces. As the kids lined up to start the match, parents buzzed around the sidelines, chatting about work, weekend plans, and school. Folding chairs and coolers created a patchwork of temporary camps along the grass. From a distance, it all looked like the portrait of suburban normalcy. But for the black father standing near the halfway line, the mood was beginning to shift. He had arrived early, parked properly, greeted a few people, and had his eyes fixed on the field where his son was warming up. Yet somehow, his presence felt like an anomaly to a few who couldn't reconcile his face with the space. It started with glances. Long, assessing stares that outlasted politeness. A few whispered conversations among a group of white parents nearby. He noticed, not with surprise, but with a sense of tired familiarity. This wasn't the first time he'd felt this quiet interrogation without words. He looked around and saw other fathers, laughing, filming, cheering. No one asked them who they were. No one approached them to verify their right to exist in that space. He adjusted his cap, checked his phone for messages, and let out a breath. He didn't want conflict. He just wanted to watch his son play. But equality rarely comes quietly, especially when it makes people uncomfortable. A volunteer coach made his way over, young, energetic, clipboard in hand. His smile faded as he approached the father, replaced by a look of business. He hesitated for a second, then asked, "Hey, are you with one of the teams?" The father responded calmly, "Yeah, my son's playing on the blue team. Number 7. The coach nodded slowly, then looked toward the bleachers. "We're asking non-family members to wait off the field area. Just trying to keep things secure." The father gave him a long look. "I told you, he's my son." There was a pause. The coach nodded, still not fully convinced, and walked away. The father watched him go, resisting the urge to shake his head. Another layer added to a lifetime of moments where he had to assert what should have been assumed. Across the field, his son scored a goal. The crowd erupted in cheers. The father clapped, proud, trying to re-enter the joy of the moment. But the tension lingered like a cloud just overhead. A mother seated near him leaned in and said, "Oh, he's your son? He's really good." Her tone was friendly, but her eyes carried a trace of surprise, as if connecting the dots between this man and that child required mental gymnastics. He nodded politely and smiled, but didn't offer more. He was used to moments like this. Moments where people didn't expect excellence from kids who looked like his son, or decency from fathers who looked like him. What no one knew, what no one had even bothered to ask, was that this man had spent more time leading American forces than most people on that field had spent outside their hometowns. He had been deployed in regions marked by conflict, given commands that carried the weight of hundreds of lives, and had stood face to face with threats that would terrify most civilians. But here, at a local soccer game, he was just a suspicious figure, a question mark, a misfit in a space that didn't welcome his kind unless they came with visible proof of belonging. Even as he stood quietly watching, his posture was unmistakable, straight, alert, composed. Decades of discipline shaped the way he held himself. He wasn't loud, didn't try to insert himself into conversations, didn't push back with anger. Because he knew something most people didn't. The loudest voices rarely have the most power. Real authority doesn't have to shout. It stands still. It waits. It lets people reveal themselves. And they did. That day, they revealed more about themselves than they realized. About how they perceive fatherhood, authority, and presence when it wears a black face. About what makes someone belong and what makes them suspicious. He didn't dress like a hero that day. He didn't wear medals or badges or a name tag with his rank. He wore a hoodie, sneakers, and a baseball cap. To them, that was all they saw. Not the commander, not the leader, not the protector of a nation. Just another black man who had to explain why he was standing on a field with white families. Just another parent who had to justify being present for his child's joy. The sound of the helicopter was impossible to ignore. Its blades chopped through the sky with rhythmic thunder, sending waves of wind across the soccer field below. Children paused their game, shielding their eyes from the sun as they looked up. Parents scrambled to stand, some pulling out their phones to record the unexpected scene. A few instinctively backed away from the field, uncertain of what was happening. The roaring noise grew louder as the aircraft descended, hovering with precision just beyond the sidelines. Dust swirled. Conversation stopped. The quiet suburb, moments ago filled with laughter and casual cheers, now held its collective breath. As the helicopter lowered, its side hatch opened, revealing a figure dressed in full Navy uniform. Immaculate white, polished black shoes, a chest lined with medals. The gold insignia shimmered against the sun. Slowly, with the weight of ceremony and intention, the man stepped out. He didn't glance around, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the cameras or the growing crowd. His face was calm, expression unreadable. Every step he took was deliberate, calculated, grounded in years of military discipline. He walked past the same sideline where, just one day before, he had been told to leave. past the folding chairs, the bleachers, the spectators who now looked on in disbelief. The parents who had questioned him now fumbled for words, their faces caught somewhere between awe and guilt. Some whispered, some stared. No one spoke directly to him. The same man they had dismissed without thought was now a symbol of honor, authority, and undeniable presence. The transformation was not in him. It was in their perception. Yesterday, they saw a stranger. Today, they saw a commander. But he had been both all along. The difference lay not in what he wore, but in what they chose to see. Children ran to the edge of the field, eyes wide. A few asked their parents, "Who is that?" Some parents answered, voices shaking slightly, "He's in the Navy." Others said nothing, unsure of how to explain their silence the day before. The helicopter remained parked in the background, its blades slowing to a halt. It was not an emergency landing. It was not a display of military power. It was a message, a reminder, a quiet assertion of value that could no longer be ignored or questioned. He didn't need to speak to make his point. The uniform did it for him. The insignias, the ribbons, the decades of service sewn into the fabric, all spoke louder than any argument ever could. He stood for a moment near the goalpost, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the field. Not in defiance, but in dignity. The same dignity he had carried the previous day when he stood on this same patch of grass in sneakers and a hoodie, cheering for his son. His son spotted him first. From across the field, the boy waved with excitement, recognizing the familiar stance and proud posture. He ran toward him, unbothered by the spectacle, because to him, this was just Dad. The same Dad who packed his lunches, helped with homework, and practiced soccer drills in the backyard. The boy didn't care about the uniform. He cared about the man inside it. And when he hugged him, he didn't hug a commander. He hugged his father. The simplicity of that moment cut deeper than the roar of the helicopter. The other children began to gather too, drawn in by curiosity. Some wanted photos. Others asked questions. The man responded with kindness, answering gently, shaking hands, smiling politely. Not because he needed validation, but because he understood what this moment meant. Not for him, but for the eyes watching. For the parents who had whispered. For the coaches who had doubted. For the children who might one day look like his own and face the same disbelief in different forms. The local news arrived shortly after, having been tipped off by someone in the crowd. Reporters pushed microphones forward, cameras focused on his face. But the man kept his responses brief. He wasn't there for attention. He was there because silence is never neutral. Because when you are dismissed in front of your child, you cannot let that message be the last word. His mere presence now challenged every assumption that had gone unchecked the day before. When assumptions walk ahead of truth, they rarely ask permission. They decide the narrative before the first word is spoken, before the first introduction is made. That's what happened that day on the soccer field. A man arrived, quiet and unassuming, blending into the casual chaos of a youth game. But to some, he stood out not because of anything he did, but because of what he looked like. His skin color arrived before his name, before his story, before his right to be there. And in that instant, he became a question to be answered instead of a father to be welcomed. That's the power of an assumption. It makes people act like gatekeepers to spaces they don't even own. He had been through worse. He had led men into dangerous territory, coordinated missions with lives on the line, and been trusted with classified information and strategic decisions that had national impact. And yet, standing on a field in a quiet suburban town, surrounded by juice boxes and soccer balls, he was viewed as the outsider. Not because of his demeanor, which was respectful, not because of his presence, which was calm, but because for some, respect must be earned twice when you're black, once for who you are, and again for who they think you're not. When the volunteer first approached him, it wasn't out of concern for the children. It was out of discomfort. Discomfort masked as protocol. A sense that something didn't align with the image of what a typical parent at this field should look like. The clipboard was just a prop. The real message was unspoken. You don't fit. That moment, that short exchange, wasn't about security. It was about control. About reminding someone they're being watched. About establishing invisible lines of belonging that don't apply equally to everyone. The man could have reacted differently. He could have raised his voice, demanded an apology, or pulled out proof of his status. But he had lived long enough to know that dignity does not require explanation. He wasn't going to put on a performance to convince people of his worth. He stood his ground with patience, not because he didn't feel the sting of disrespect, but because he knew the power of restraint. And because he knew his son was watching. What those around him didn't realize was that this wasn't just a father attending a soccer game. This was a moment layered with history. A quiet reminder that even in 2025, assumptions still walk ahead of introductions. That in places meant for joy and community, bias still wears a smile and carries a clipboard. And for the man in question, this wasn't a unique experience. It was simply a familiar one. Replayed in a new location, it's easy to dismiss these moments as misunderstandings. Easy to explain them away with phrases like, just doing my job, or, we ask everyone the same thing. But that's rarely the truth. The truth is in the selective enforcement, the unequal scrutiny, the questions asked of some and not others. The truth is in who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets the burden of proof. And the people at that soccer field were not malicious. They were ordinary. That's what made it harder. It wasn't hate that created the moment. It was something quieter, more dangerous. Habit. When the helicopter arrived the next day, it wasn't for revenge. It wasn't a show of ego. It was a demonstration of reality. The man who had been asked to leave was not just a father. He was a symbol of a deeper contradiction, that someone can serve their country with loyalty and honor, and still be made to feel unwelcome in a space where no such loyalty is required. That someone can wear a uniform that commands global respect, but still need to prove themselves to a stranger with a clipboard on American soil, and still, he didn't gloat. He didn't point fingers or call names. He stood tall, not for show, but for truth. Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't confrontation, it's presence. To be seen fully, not because of what you wear, but because of who you are. To take the space that's yours without apology. To show your child that their father doesn't shrink in the face of ignorance. That dignity can be quiet. That strength can look like patience. The moment the man stepped out of the helicopter, silence fell over the field. Not because of fear, but because something sacred had arrived. Not sacred in the religious sense, but sacred in the form of earned honor, of invisible burdens carried without complaint. The crisp lines of his Navy uniform spoke volumes where words would have failed. Everything from the polished shoes to the ribbons on his chest told a story of discipline, sacrifice, and duty. And yet, none of those things had protected him from being doubted. None of those medals had been visible when he stood on the sidelines in civilian clothes, trying to watch his son play. On that day, no one had asked about his service. They had only asked if he belonged. This dissonance between service and suspicion is one that many people of color know all too well. You can serve your country, let its people, defend its values, and still be asked to explain yourself in everyday spaces. Still be stopped, questioned, challenged, or dismissed. You can carry a title that inspires respect on paper, only to be treated with doubt the moment you step into a park, a store, a field, without the visual proof of your accomplishments. For this father, the soccer field was not a battlefield, but the sting of judgment felt like a familiar enemy. The children didn't understand the deeper implications. To them, a helicopter landing at their weekend game was thrilling. Their eyes lit up, not with politics, but with excitement. They rushed to see the man in white, asked questions about flying, about the Navy, about what it meant to be in uniform. Their innocence was beautiful and painful at the same time, because it showed what could exist if bias didn't enter so early. If the world didn't teach children who to doubt and who to welcome based on skin, clothing, or unfamiliarity. The children saw all. The adults saw contradiction. The man hadn't asked for a spectacle. He had not requested the helicopter. That decision had been made higher up, by leaders who understood that some lessons aren't taught in classrooms or manuals. Some lessons are delivered by action. And in this case, the message was clear. We don't just honor our commanders when they're at war. We honor them when they're standing silently beside a soccer goal, cheering for their son like any other parent. We honor them not because of their title, but because they've given something that can't be repaid. Their time, their service, their sacrifice. As he stood at midfield, some of the very people who had doubted him now struggled to meet his eyes. They shuffled uncomfortably, adjusting sunglasses, pretending to look at their phones, searching for something to say that could close the gap between what they assumed and what was now undeniable. Some approached quietly, offering weak smiles or clumsy words of recognition. A few offered thanks for his service. But he didn't need apologies. He didn't need praise. What he needed, what the moment demanded, was reflection. In the days that followed, the story spread. Social media posts, news clips, whispered conversations in grocery stores. Some people were angry, not at the man, but at the discomfort his story caused. They didn't want to believe that such bias still existed in their neighborhood. They wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. But discomfort is often the birthplace of truth. And the truth was that many in that community had never been forced to examine how they move through the world with unearned ease, while others carry invisible burdens. Even in moments of rest, the father didn't change his routine. He kept showing up. He attended more games, stood in the same spot, dressed the same way. He didn't need to arrive in a helicopter every time to be seen. The point had already been made. His consistency was part of the message, that he wouldn't be pushed out of spaces that were as much his as anyone else's. That presence, in its quiet, steady form, was power. That being there for his child, again and again, was a form of resistance more meaningful than any viral clip. And as his son looked up at him after every game, sweaty and smiling, there was a silent understanding between them. The child didn't need to fully grasp the social complexity to feel the security of his father's presence. To know that his dad would stand beside him, in victory or doubt, in silence or applause. That he could be proud, not just of what his father did in uniform, but of how he moved through a world that didn't always make space for him, and made space anyway. The image of the helicopter became a symbol, not just of rank or military might, but of correction, of the narrative being shifted in real time. It carved into the memory of every person on that field a powerful visual they would never forget. But what mattered more than the helicopter was the reason it was there. It wasn't to embarrass anyone. It wasn't to intimidate. It was to remind people that dignity is not conditional. That respect should not depend on uniforms, titles, or appearances. That every human being carries a story you haven't read yet. And that sometimes the people you dismiss are the very ones who've done the most for your freedom to stand where you stand. When people heard about the incident afterward, many asked why the Navy got involved. Why respond so dramatically to what some would call a small incident? But it wasn't a small thing. It was the kind of moment that chips away at someone's sense of belonging, slowly, over years. The kind of moment that doesn't make headlines, but shapes how people feel in public spaces. How welcome they are. How safe they are to simply exist without being questioned. And for the military, whose members come from every background, defending one of their own wasn't just symbolic. It was a matter of principle. A matter of protecting the integrity and honor of a man who had spent decades doing just that for others. The father hadn't filed a complaint. He hadn't demanded justice. He didn't go on the news or speak publicly. He didn't need to. The truth of what happened didn't need embellishment. The impact of the moment spoke for itself. But others within the Navy took it seriously. They knew that while he might endure such treatment with grace, it wasn't something to normalize. It wasn't something to let pass without acknowledgement. Because when the people who serve are disrespected at home, it sends a message that their sacrifice only matters overseas. Not in the grocery store, not in the park, not on the sidelines of a soccer game. The most profound lessons are often the quietest. No speeches were made that day. No confrontations erupted. But change doesn't always require volume. Sometimes it only requires truth to be seen clearly, without excuse. And the truth was clear. The people on that field had made a decision about who he was based on nothing more than skin and context. Not actions, not words, not conduct. Just the surface of a man who didn't match their expectation of a father. In that setting, in classrooms and boardrooms across the country, discussions were sparked by the story. Teachers used it to talk about implicit bias. Leadership groups used it to explore the difference between perception and reality. Families discussed it at dinner tables, asking hard questions about what they would have done if they had been there. Would they have spoken up? Would they have made the same assumptions? Would they have even noticed? The discomfort of those questions meant the story had done what it was supposed to do, not just evoke emotion, but reflection. The father's son continued to play soccer every week. Nothing about him had changed, but his presence on that field now carried weight. Other parents approached him differently. Coaches gave him nods of respect. Kids from other teams came to talk to him about the helicopter, about the Navy, about what it means to serve. Without realizing it, He had become a living lesson in character, in humility, in strength that doesn't seek attention. His silence had taught more than 100 speeches could, and yet, he didn't ask for any of it. All he wanted was to be there for his son, to clap from the sidelines, to smile when his boy scored, to offer a thumbs up from across the field. His goals were simple, ordinary even. But the road to ordinary moments isn't always smooth for people like him. That's what many failed to understand. That being present, being seen, being treated fairly, those things aren't extra. They're basic. And when they're denied, it's not just offensive. It's exhausting. Behind every moment of discrimination is 1,000 silent ones that went unnoticed. Behind every assumption is a lifetime of experiences shaped by the same pattern. And behind every uniform is a person who lives a full life outside of duty. A father, a neighbor, a coach, a friend. The mistake made on that field wasn't just about race or class. It was about forgetting to look beyond first impressions. Forgetting to pause before acting on a hunch. Forgetting that the most extraordinary people often walk among us, unnoticed, until a moment of truth brings them into focus.